You're listening to 94.4 FM Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show.
You're listening to 94.4 FM Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show, with your host, Jimmy Petruzzi. Bringing you news from the local area and around the world. And on this show, we've been very fortunate to interview some of the world's best athletes, sports people who work in football across a broad range of areas, psychologists, sports scientists, coaches. We've also interviewed people in the field of psychology. We also have a segment speaking to people in the field of psychology, some of the most influential people in the field of psychology in related fields who give an insight into their perception around the field of psychology. They were really interesting guests, and if you're really interesting, I've certainly read a lot of his work, and I know we have a broad range of listeners. You probably have too. So he's going to give us an insight into the world of sports science in football. So, sports scientist Chris Barnes, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Thanks very much for the invitation, Jimmy. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's really great to have you on board. And just for our listeners, Chris, I mean, I'm sort of very familiar with your work and have a huge amount of respect for the work you've done, and certainly, have sort of read. But just for our listeners, and to give them an insight into what sort of work do you do? Have you been doing for many, many years now?
Yeah, of course. I guess just to give some kind of context to this, if I go back to when I first started to work in professional football, so this was around about 1997, and I was actually working full-time in a university at Teesside, and I took a random phone call from a guy that I'd done a little bit of research with, who was a local cardiologist, but also he was a member of the medical board at Middlesbrough Football Club. And the chairman of the club at the time, Steve Gibson, Steve was always been very ambitious for the club. And at that point in time, Middlesbrough they'd had a player, Fabrizio Ravanelli, Italian guy, at the club. And the signing of Ravanelli was a real big thing. As a lot of people will be aware, it made a lot of news. And he played for the club for a year, and it was an up and down year where they got to 2 cup finals, lost them both, and they got relegated. So Fabrizio told the chairman that he'd be moving on. He wasn't overly keen on playing in Tier 2 football, but advised him at the time that if he was serious about progressing the club, there were a couple of things that he should look to perhaps address. One of them was they needed a professional training ground. At the time, they were getting changed at the stadium and then travelling to the local university playing fields to train. But then the other thing that he said was, you really need to look at the way in which you treat sports science and medicine. And so Steve had a good look at this and charged the medical board with coming up with a strategy for science and medicine. These guys were all medics. They understood sports medicine, but they had no experience of sports science. And so this is where Adrian got in touch with me, initially just to have a conversation. It was a 1-hour telephone call. But that grew into a series of meetings where I got involved in helping them with the design of the new facility and the idea as to what a sports science department could look like. And then ultimately, they realised that they did need somebody to actually drive this and implement the plan into practice, and so I was offered the position at Middlesbrough. So I found myself, I landed in the middle of professional football with absolutely no experience of working in the game, and the good thing was, at the time, there were 1 or 2 people working either part-time or in a full-time capacity as fitness coaches, but very few. So there really wasn't anybody around who'd had any experience of it before. And so as I flapped and fluttered my way around, making any number of errors and mistakes in the early days, very few people were really aware of this because there was nobody there who'd actually lived this before. And so I did 12 years full-time with Middlesbrough, during which time, with the support of the chairman and the club, I think we did some really exciting things in terms of beginning to develop the position and the role of science in football. We employed, in conjunction with the university, a few people who conducted PhDs while working with the junior squads. We embarked on testing and monitoring programs which had never been seen before in professional football. And so I hope that some of the work that we did kind of laid some of the foundations for what it is that we see today.
Absolutely. It's really interesting. I mean, so I guess in one sense, Chris, you're like one of the pioneers really in the UK, in England anyway, in terms of developing sports science. I mean, you mentioned Ravanelli there, and my guess is that obviously him coming from Italy at the time, and would it be fair to say that maybe in Europe they were slightly ahead at that point, in the mid-90s, in terms of, Arsene Wenger came over here and he sort of brought his own ideas? Would that be, I mean, you'd be better placed to sort of comment on that than me, but do you think maybe sort of Europe had a bit of a head start and people like yourself kind of, raised the bar really?
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, there was a lot of good work going on in the UK, and it was very much academically led. People like Tom Riley at Liverpool, John Moores University.
Absolutely,
but the majority of sports science in the UK at the time was focused on Olympic sports. And for sure, you're absolutely right. The Italians and the Spanish to a lesser extent were very much, I guess they invested more in the scientific basis of football. And so, for example, when Rav came over to the UK, he actually brought his own chef with him. Wow. So he had a full-time chef that was employed, and this was great for the guys at the club, because this chef would actually travel with the team when they went to away games, and he'd go into the hotel kitchens and prepare this. It was wonderful food, but it was also food that's appropriate for the needs of an athlete. Most definitely, he brought a sense of professionalism that was, don't get me wrong, football most definitely was professional, but the level of professionalism that he brought was a step above where we were at the time.
It's really interesting, and I mean, sort of rewinding back to '97 now, 2021, and the game in the last 20 years seems to sort of have gone so quick. I mean, every sort of club now has got, well, you could make a point that every club's got maybe a sports scientist these days for the most part. But what do you see the biggest changes, Chris, when you first began to now, when you look around and think, wow, it's incredible what a huge role sports science has now in the game?
It is, and of course, sports science has helped us in so many ways in terms of the game of football. But an awful lot of things haven't changed as well, and we'll probably go on to discussing the relationship between the performance staff, as we call them now, and the technical or coaching staff, which is key to this. In terms of, I guess, what this has brought to the game is, I mean, at the end of the day, fundamentally, the work of the sports scientists is about ensuring that there is a structured approach to the planning and review of what it is that we do with the players themselves. And then obviously in performing those functions, in performing those functions, we've got to understand an awful lot more about the demands of the game itself, and also what it is that is necessary and is required of the players themselves. And we've done that through structured programs of testing of the fitness of players, but also more recently, pretty much every professional football club now will monitor the activity profiles of players on a day-to-day basis. And what we're actually able to do now, I think, a lot better than we ever were when I came into the game, is, football's a team sport, but we're now able to treat each and every player as an individual and look at their own strengths and weaknesses and their own potential, and actually tailor bespoke interventions around the specific needs of these individuals.
That's really fascinating, and how far sort of the game's come along in that respect. And I mean, with that sort of, Chris, I mean, what sort of, I mean, obviously, I'm sure there's certain things you're going to keep close, confidential. But what sort of equipment do you kind of use for that? Is this? I mean, I know these days you've got GPS and many different things you could use, but is technology played a big part in being able to do that?
Yeah, I mean, the technology nowadays, the technology that I would say most of the sports science community are most reliant on a day-to-day basis. So on the training field, most definitely, we've got the GPS technologies, which everybody refers to them as GPS, but there's actually a whole host of sensors within these devices that give us real insight into the demands of training, but also the impact of those demands on the individual player. But then also, that's just on the training field. If you were to go into the gymnasium for most of the professional football clubs now, you'll see a whole host of equipment in there that enables us to get insight into not just how much work players are doing in the gym, but the kind of, the force profiles for pretty much each and every repetition that they perform in there. So again, it's just further building that individual picture of the capacity and the capabilities of players.
And would you say that, Chris, like from your experience in the game, from that athleticism, how different were the players now, do you think, in terms of, say, in 97? I know it's probably difficult to measure because the data was different, eras are different, but in terms of athleticism, do you think all that sort of contributed to players being just that extra 2-3% or maybe more athletic?
Yeah, I mean, if you start from the game itself, I think we've got more than enough evidence to show that the physical demands of the game are increasing. And in tandem with that, I think, and it's not just the scientists, I think it's very much a team effort between the scientists and the medics, the analysts, the coaches, but we are training players more effectively. We're also training players more efficiently, and what that results in is the physical capacity of the modern day footballer is actually definitely greater than that we might have seen in the days when I first moved into the game. Now, one part of that actually results from the players. Today's player will probably, if you've got a 21-year-old today, they'll have already been in the game for a minimum of 12 years in a structured way. The modern football academies embrace science from the absolute outset, and so it's not quite as full on and as intensive as you'll get with your professional players, your full-time professional players, but nevertheless there's testing and monitoring takes place of players right the way through their football career nowadays, and the modern day player is the result of the close attention of multidisciplinary teams right from the outset. Absolutely. And in terms of fitness testing, Chris, how has that sort of changed over the years? Has that changed at all since, say, with sort of technology and sort of the devices available now, like the reaction time and other things? Has it changed considerably, or is it still there's some similarities? I mean, fundamentally, no. The fitness testing side of things, which just to distinguish, so the monitoring is really the information that we would collect on a daily basis from players. That's the monitoring side of things.
Yes.
Whereas the testing is something that you might perform on 2, 3 or 4 occasions a year. And, fundamentally, we're testing the same things. We're testing speed, we're testing agility, we're testing endurance. Yeah. And a lot of the tests that we use nowadays are pretty much the same as we have used over the years. Yeah. It's just the monitoring. Yeah. So we're actually testing the same things, which is good because by using the same tests over a long period of time, we can actually, we can say with confidence that the modern player looks different to, let's say, the player of 20 or 25 years ago. And not just the modern professional player, but we've got data going back all those years for the younger developing players as well. So we can actually see how the whole thing's evolved. But fundamentally, we are really testing the same things that we did years ago. The tools that we use may have changed slightly, and they may be that bit more reliable, and they may be a little bit easier to use. But ultimately, the good thing about the testing is when you're testing things like endurance, speed, and the like, communication of the outcome from that is something that's really easy to have a conversation with coaches and players. They all understand those parameters.
Yeah.
The interesting one nowadays still actually is the way in which we monitor players, and still I think we're not quite there in terms of, we collect a huge amount of information on a daily basis, and sometimes we get lost in the numbers and we get lost in the science, and we are not as effective as we should be in communicating the outcome of what we see on the training field to the coaches, because ultimately, if we don't do that effectively, there's no point in collecting the information. We have to impact on the decisions that coaches make in practice.
Absolutely, yeah, no, definitely, and I think what I find interesting is with some of the data that's so some of the comparisons that sort of between, say, professional and amateur, and in your experience, Chris, where do you sort of see? I mean, obviously professionals can train every day. One thing that sort of intrigues me, is it maybe because the sort of genetic, capability of the professional takes them as far as they do? Is it because they train every day? Is it a combination of all those things? But where do you sort of see the big differences physically between, say, professional and maybe a semi-pro?
To be perfectly truthful, Jimmy, from a physical perspective, so we go back to the testing of the players. There aren't actually that many differences between the professional player and the amateur player. Where the differences will occur is in terms of your technical ability.
Yeah. And
so what will happen is that your professional players are actually much more efficient. They're much more efficient in terms of processing the information they collect, so effectively decision making, and then the technical execution of the skill side of the game. So the net result of that is you've got two animals there who essentially might have the same capacity. So they may have the same top speed, they may have very similar endurance capabilities. But the way in which the professional players will go about executing what's demanded of them in training will be a lot more efficient. So they've got a lot more left in reserve. Yeah. And this is what enables these players to be able to go in and train on a day-to-day basis. They will recover that bit quicker, and their execution of the requirements of training is actually that much more efficient.
So in one sense, you could almost like take, say, a semi-pro player could maybe take a bit of extra time and get themselves to a certain level physically, but and sort of cover that variable and produce maybe similar stats. But then you've got the execution of decision making on top of that could be a difference.
It's a huge difference, yeah. And so even simple tasks within training or within the game, generally speaking, your better players will conduct those tasks at a lower cost, if you like.
Of course, yeah.
So they're not tapping into the resources to the same extent that your players, your semi-professional players and your amateur players would do.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's obviously a combination of things, I suppose, in terms of the player developing to that level. But I suppose from your take as a sports scientist, the key thing is obviously for a player to be at that level physically to sort of to optimize their physical ability. alongside obviously everything else is I mean, and that's where the testing comes in. I would think, Chris, where you sort of monitor where they're up to throughout the year, maybe start of the season. You periodise the plan, and is that sort of for you the data coming in helps you to sort of monitor the players daily to make sure they're keeping to those levels?
And that's absolutely the case. So, I mean, it shouldn't really surprise you, but obviously we work with the players on a daily basis, collecting information on what's taking place in training. Now, most days, training actually goes as we might have planned, and there's nothing remarkable in the information that we collect on players. And so, what I think we as practitioners have to understand is, look, if there's nothing remarkable in the information that we've collected, let's not bother the coaches with that, because what we plan to do tomorrow in training, we believe is perfectly doable, and let's just go into tomorrow's training as we'd planned. So the message to the coach quite simply is, training was good today, coach, let's continue tomorrow. Mm-hmm. The time when the information then becomes interesting is, if we notice in the information that we collect that there's something slightly different to what we might have expected in training, and if that's the case that it's for one player or two players, then it's a case of pulling that one or two players and just having a general conversation with them. We notice that training today for you looked a little bit different for this. Just trying to actually have a conversation. Is everything okay with yourself? Blah 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 blah, and just work out whether there is a rationale or a reason for that. Mm. And on the basis of that, it could be that you put a little word in the coach's ear in relation to these players. Either this player maybe tomorrow could do with a little bit more intensive work, let's say, or this player, let's just be a little bit careful if we can with them. If you see something in the information that is more broadly applied to a larger proportion of the squad, then it's the chance to get hold of the coach and say, look, training today, a case might be that we planned for today to be a high tempo session in particular. And we're going to achieve certain of our physical goals within this day's training, but because technically the session didn't run as the coach would have liked, he's continually stopping it, and we never actually achieved that tempo. So, the message, rather than fill the coach with a spreadsheet full of data, just the message to the coach is, look, realise that training wasn't from your side as effective today as we might have wanted, but there was also a knock-on effect on the intensity of training. We didn't achieve the intensity targets that we'd wanted. Mm-hmm. Is there a way tomorrow, perhaps, that we can just use a couple of parts of training just to actually ensure that we address that thing that we need to? Absolutely. So it's kind of going beyond the science, and this is no disrespect whatsoever to coaches, but ultimately it's trying to tease out the 1, 2 or 3 key messages to put in the coach's mind going forward the following day. And that's really the beauty of what this monitoring equipment allows us to do, because we're not reliant on testing that we might perform every 2, 4, 6 or 12 weeks or whatever, but we're actually getting daily feedback on where the players lie.
Absolutely, and that's a really interesting point that you make there, Chris. I mean, it's I guess in the other sense is sort of having specialists like yourselves to interpret the data and then sort of lay to the coaches, because the coach no doubt's going to want it in just lay terms. Where do we go? And they've got their own work to do. So it's one thing, but the monitoring I can see can make life a lot easier, I guess, because with technology. You can sort of do it in real time, so you can sort of see that knock-on effect, and the output is obviously a player that is going to perform at a more optimal level, you would think, unless other variables come in, like obviously other things that be it psychology or nutrition or whatever, really. But in terms of your test, Chris, I mean, I've sort of seen some of the tests and some of the data you've put. One of the tests I find really interesting is the 10 by 100 meter shuttle. I think it's quite an interesting one, really, for me, in terms of looking at, say, semi-pro players in particular. But I mean, in terms of, I know it's difficult to say because there's so many tests out there. But just as a general, for say we have a lot of semi-pro listeners, and I do a bit of work for a couple of semi-pro team too. But just for them, in terms of what do you think would be a useful test for them as a barometer? I know it's hard to put you on the spot there, but just as if you had what would be like a couple of useful tests for them to use the barometer to measure some of the football demands.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, football is one of the most complicated sports in the world.
Yeah.
It's one of the most random sports, and from a physical perspective, draws upon a whole host of different qualities. So, I mean, you mentioned, this 10 by 100 metre is a test that the guys at the FA had put together, and they've got some pretty strong norms for the younger players there. The beauty of a test like that is you don't need any equipment. You just need a football pitch, and because it's conducted over a few minutes, you just need a stopwatch or some form of a watch. And the beauty of it is that it's easily repeatable. So one of the things that you want to be certain about is if you're going to start to test fitness, you want to be sure that you're going to engage with it fully, rather than just perform one test and then forget about it and just give you a benchmark. Absolutely. What you want to do is to use that to map and monitor fitness over a period of time. Yeah. So, what I would definitely say is, a test like that, or a 1 kilometre linear run over a track. I mean, it really doesn't matter what you decide. It could be, okay, how far can I run in 4 minutes? It could be, do I time myself over 1,000 or 1,200 metres? Do I time myself running the circumference of a pitch 4 times? So long as it's something that you can repeat, then effectively what you're taking away is external noise from the test. Yeah, and I would say keep it as simple as possible in that respect. There are tests that are widely used by football clubs that are relatively cheap, that involve, I'm sure you're familiar with, people would call it the beep test. Absolutely, there's a whole series of different variations on the beep test or the yo-yo test that people will use. And certainly myself, working in clubs and working more recently in clubs, every 5 or 6 weeks, on a Tuesday morning, if we had a game on a Saturday, we would use one of the yo-yo tests. It's called the yo-yo intermittent recovery test, level 1. But we would actually use the first 6 minutes of that for all players, and we'd collect heart rate data.
Oh, okay.
And the heart rate data that we collected within that test was a really useful measure of the physical condition of the players at that point in time. And the beauty of that is, when you're doing this testing, you don't want it's not that you're trying to con people, but you don't want testing to look like testing, because not just football players, but all athletes hate being tested. Absolutely. The beauty of doing that test there was it was the first 6 minutes of training.
Brilliant.
And with it being sub-maximal, you're not running players to fatigue, but we're actually collecting really useful and valuable objective information on an individual level.
Yes, yeah.
So, we look at the heart rate at, say, 4 minutes and 6 minutes into the test, and then at the end of the test, we just ask the players to stand for a couple of minutes, and we look at the way in which the heart rate recovers. And that provides really, really useful insight into internal elements, elements related to those players as individuals.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point, that, Chris. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I was sort of every as I help out with semi-pro team, every now and again I'll sort of do like the phosphagen test, like sprint for 7 seconds. How far can you go? And I don't want to tell them it's a test as such. It'll just part of training, some sprint work, 23 seconds rest in between, and it just gives you a bit of an idea. And I suppose time is the biggest thing. It's like, in terms of for the part-time players, fitting it all in. Then obviously the data, some of them work full-time, and other stuff is sort of doing any training around that. But yeah, I mean, sort of obviously what I found interesting, that I think it's really useful, that the data that you've put out there, because you give you a bit of a ballpark. I think there's also a novelty for them too, Chris, if you sort of tell them, well, this is sort of an idea of where a pro might be for, say, a Cooper test, a beef test, whatever. I think some of them will go away and think, well, let me just see where I'm up to comparatively type things. So do you find also the testing sort of motivation for some players to think, I'll go away and see how far, or how I can improve my results as well?
Oh yeah. I mean, listen, the modern day footballer is a professional, 100% professional, and they're all motivated by trying to be the best they can be.
Yeah.
And so sometimes when you introduce testing of the players, of course it's a little bit of a sales pitch. In a way, to the players, because the natural reaction when you've got a group of players together will be a bit of huffing and puffing if they see that there's a little bit of testing taking place.
Yeah.
But as I say, nowadays we are in a position where we have the capacity to collect so much information on a day-to-day basis that the need for this sporadic testing is somewhat removed.
Yeah.
So. A case in point, I guess, would be, we know that some people talk about speed work acting as something of a vaccine for to protect hamstrings, to protect what we call a posterior chain, the glutes, hamstrings, calves, and what have you. So one of the things that we look at in the data that we're collecting on a daily basis will be, okay, how fast do the players run today? And the GPS trackers give us that information. Now, generally speaking, what we would do with players is, if we know the players haven't got above 90% of their own individual maximum speed by, let's say, a Wednesday, at the end of the warm-up on a Thursday, we'd just introduce a couple of sprint races where we'd pair the players up, where they were relatively evenly matched, and they'd do a 30-metre race against each other. You only need to do a couple, but just in order that you're priming these muscles, and what you're doing is, I think there's quite a lot of evidence now to tell you that just performing these activities, if they're not achieving high speeds in training, will just help to provide that little bit of additional protection against injury.
Absolutely, yeah. That's fascinating. That's I think it's really fascinating. It's a huge area. So I want to thank you for your time, Chris. I could sort of carry on speaking to you, I suppose, from a personal point of view. You find it really interesting, and certainly is always, great to learn. But I really want to thank you for coming on board. But before we sort of go, where do you see it going, Chris? Sort of in terms of sports science, it's come so far, but do you sort of see it moving forward? In terms of, I know it's difficult to gauge, but where do you see it going from here? It's come along so far, so fast. Can it sort of carry on at this pace?
Yeah, so I can see it going two ways. The first one is it will continue to develop in such a way that we're going to get deeper insights into the physiology of the individual players. And so, we will be able to look at things like gene profiling, which genes predispose themselves to players having greater chance of success in the game. There will be, without doubt, we will start to collect all sorts of data on things like hydration levels and hormonal profiles within the game. But that more specialist information is actually, on one level, it's going away from the game itself. Because the most important thing to me, in terms of any information that we collect, is it going to impact on performance? And for the most part, what that demands is that we can have a conversation with players and a conversation with coaches around this information. And so, for me, the other way that things will continue and have to continue to develop is, as well as a sports scientist being a scientist and somebody who has a deep knowledge of the physiology of the game, they also have to be a communicator, and they have to be an interpreter, and the person that ensures that the right information ends up in the right hands to make the right decisions. So there's almost development in terms of, and I wouldn't say generalising or dumbing down, that's not the case. It's in terms of interpretation of this information and what matters. But then there are others who might well live in laboratories and live in dark rooms and do continue to push the boundaries in terms of the deep understanding of the impact of football training and games.
Absolutely, and that's one thing for sure. It's I guess in one sense it is exciting times in terms of nothing stands still, but certainly, like you've mentioned there, I think some of the gene profile, hormonal profiling, it just it does raise the bar in terms of, you would imagine, the physical enhancing the physical capabilities of the players. But I suppose in one sense, there's people, the football purist out there might be thinking, okay, you sort of get the sort of player that defies all odds. Chris just sort of turns up in the training ground and just defies all odds in terms of. Do you think that's going to be less and less over the years now in terms of maybe that sort of that sort of raw, skillful player? It's just the game's just moving so fast physiologically.
No, I think that play will always exist, and even today, I guess the best example of I don't really want to call him a maverick. He's definitely not a maverick, but Messi on a physical level is probably not the most gifted. But nobody's going to argue with the fact that he's clearly, one of the best, and a lot of people would say the best footballer in the world at present. And I guess the contrast to him, in a way, is the person that everybody will measure him up against, which Cristiano Ronaldo. And you look at him, and he is clearly a superbly gifted footballer, but he is an absolute out-and-out athlete. And a real physical specimen. And listen, one of the first signings that we made at Middlesbrough when I was there was Paul Gascoigne. And Gazza was, some of the things that we would see him do on a training field just made everybody just stop and gasp. He was an absolute maverick, an unbelievably gifted football player, and I think there will always be people of that ilk in the game. And let's be honest, we all want there to be players of that ilk. That's what makes football the sport it is.
For sure, definitely. No, definitely. That's fascinating. I think that's for sure. Like you mentioned, I think that's what come to mind. The contrast between Messi and Ronaldo, and obviously people. They're great. They're obviously both players that are great in their own way. It's difficult to sort of make a comparison, really. Like I said, from a physical point of view, certainly, there's a contrast there. But it's fascinating stuff. But I want to thank you for your time, Chris. It's been really fascinating speaking to you. I'm sure the listeners have really enjoyed that as well. And I certainly encourage them to sort of look out for some of the data. Any sort of semi-pro amateur player, anyone who's just interested in that sort of stuff, to look at some of the data you've got out there. It's just fascinating stuff. I think even just for a recreational player that maybe wants to improve a little bit, it's well worth having a look to see where they're up to. So thanks again, Chris. Thanks for your time, and I wish you all the best. And it was great speaking to you.
Okay, thank you very much as well, Jimmy. I hope there was something of value in that.
Absolutely, that was great, Chris. That was sports scientist Chris Barnes on the Salford 94.4, Salford City Radio 94.4 FM Friday Sports Show. If your host, Jimmy Petruzzi.